So first of all, welcome everybody to our not very regular Vermont chapter community conversations. Tonight, we have a great topic to discuss, the clean heat standard, which is making its way through the Vermont legislature. It's passed out of the House Energy and Technology Committee and soon to appropriations and on its way. It's drawn some controversy because of different points of view out there. It's new. It's a lot of people feel it's very important, and some people feel it's kind of risky. So hopefully we'll get a good chance to explore those ideas tonight. And with us tonight are some people who have been looking into the bill and to related issues very closely. So we have Ben Edgerly-Walsh from Vermont Public Interest Research Group with us. We've got Rachel Smolker from Biofuel Watch, and we have Julie Masuga from Global Energy Monitor, and they'll all be joining us shortly.
So the clean heat standard is, is originally in Vermont, kind of conceived of through a working group or an action team, Energy Action Network, and it was taken up, was recommended by the Climate Council, the Vermont Climate Council, that was created through the Global Warming Solutions Act. It was taken up this legislative session in the House Energy and Technology Committee, chaired by Representative Tim Briglin, and they have been taking testimony and digging into it over the last couple of months, and ultimately passed it out, I believe, last Thursday on a 7-2 vote. And essentially, what it boils down to is this would be a legal obligation on fossil fuel companies in the sort of broad thermal sector, which includes heating, but is not just heating. So it's residential, commercial, and industrial space heating, but also other end uses for things like oil and gas that aren't transportation. So industrial uses, for instance, would be covered by it. And it would put this obligation on the companies selling fossil fuels into Vermont, or in some cases, the first fossil fuel company in Vermont selling a fossil fuel for those thermal uses, to actually reduce greenhouse gas emissions in the thermal sector on a life cycle basis, in line with the legal requirements in the Global Warming Solutions Act. It would create a system of clean heat credits that a company, either one of the companies required to do this work, or any other company installing or selling a clean heat measure, which would be eligible under the bill: biofuels, renewable natural gas, cold climate heat pumps, weatherization, geothermal systems, hybrid, heat pump water heaters, a whole host of different technologies. The basic requirement being, on a life cycle basis, these technologies would need to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, and all of the measures adopted would need to add up to our climate pollution reduction requirements under the Solutions Act: 40% by 2030, 80% by 2050. So at a very high level, that's what this is. It would be the first time that most oil and propane companies in Vermont would have anything like this kind of requirement. It's somewhat similar to the renewable energy standard in the electric sector. Electric companies are already required to provide renewable electricity for their customers. It would be different from that in that it would be based on life cycle greenhouse gas emissions, not a sort of binary definition of is it renewable, is it not renewable. And in that, it would actually be based on the legal requirements for pollution reductions in the Solutions Act, rather than in the Renewable Energy Standard, some very different goals that predated the Solutions Act by a number of years.
Thanks, Ben. Much appreciated. Had to juggle a mobile hotspot to get back on here, but thanks for filling in there at a moment's notice. So that's the overview. I think now we're going to turn to Rachel and Julie. One of the things, as I'm sure Ben mentioned, as the providers, obligated parties, those importers of fuels and are required to do, they're going to be searching out and providing somehow those clean heat services, and they can do it through the use of efficiency, heat pumps, all those technology-based things, weatherization. But the other thing they can do is supply fuels that come across as lower in greenhouse gas emissions. So somehow cleaning up fossil fuel sector that the fossil fuel that they bring into the state. And that's what Julie and Rachel are going to be talking about here. And do we say we're going to start with Julie? Julie, are you ready to jump in? Julie's going to address the issue. Julie's done a ton of work on natural gas in general. And she's going to talk to us tonight about renewable natural gas. So
yeah.
Julie.
So my name is Julie Masuga. I use she, her pronouns, and I work as a researcher for Global Energy Monitor, which is a worldwide organization that catalogs energy projects as well as their impacts on human rights, health, and economies. Before that, I was the co-director and fossil fuel resistance organizer for 350 Vermont for a number of years and became intimately familiar with Vermont's energy sector, in particular Vermont gas and their so-called renewable natural gas, as well as all of the problems that come along with the pipeline and the importing of fracked gas. So in lieu of having any kind of formal PowerPoint or anything like that, I think I'm just going to read an excerpt from an op-ed that I tried to get published a number of months or maybe a year ago. And I'll preface that by saying I'm really grateful to have this platform to talk about renewable natural gas, because it has been very difficult to get that out into the public. I think part of that might be that, Neil Lunderville, the CEO of Vermont Gas, is on the board of the Vermont Journalism Trust. And so they're not really publishing things about this, no matter how many times I talk to them. And so I'm really glad to be able to have this opportunity to speak to y'all tonight about what's actually happening here. So I'm just going to read a little bit. Let's see. So this is a little bit dated, but it's still pretty accurate. It was back when Don Rendell was still the CEO. But despite being on trial during September over numerous allegations supported by thousands of documents that that Vermont Gas's ANGP pipeline was built in a manner that violated their certificate of public good, Rendell, the CEO, was to give a talk at Energy Action Network's next major event. Vermont Gas Systems is full of literal and figurative bullshit. They are selling it to customers as a climate solution. The former CEO of Vermont Gas and Green Mountain Power's parent company, Honorgier, told us that fossil fuel is not chocolate. And when we dared to speak out to save our home and climate from Vermont Gas's pipeline, a week later, Vermont Gas became controlled by Enbridge, the fossil fuel giant that has been responsible for travesties like KXL and now Line 3. So Don Rendell was to give this talk about social responsibility at VBSR's 30th annual conference. And it was beneath this slick banner that told me to expect anti-racism, business resiliency, and climate crisis. First, for business resiliency, let's take a look at what Neil Lunderville took over for Vermont Gas. So-called renewable natural gas, which is the heart of what I want to talk about tonight, biogas, which is biogas and requires waste to produce, is Vermont Gas's newest endeavor. Customers can pay extra fees for up to 100% renewably sourced landfill gas, despite the renewable gas only making up 2% of their product. So if you say you're a doctor and you have a patient that has cancer and you tell them you've removed 2% of their cancer, but they're going to be fine, don't worry about the other 98%. That's kind of how I see this. The only way to scale up biogas to fill something like a pipeline system is to grow crops specifically for that renewable natural gas, which would then involve land grabs, deforestation. It's a Trojan horse to keep fracking alive. And the other thing is, like, almost none of this is actually coming, well, none of the product in the pipeline is actually coming from Vermont. We're actually paying a tariff on trash from Quebec to be injected into the pipeline, and we're calling that a climate solution. So we're paying tariff on trash, and that is apparently the way forward. Let's see. In the interest of time, I'm gonna skip ahead a little bit. Right. So millions of dollars leave the state to go to Iowa and Quebec and Alberta, which are the places that we're getting the fracked gas and the so-called RNG, which is followed by irreparable harm. But who is Vermont gas and who is being harmed locally? For that, I've found that migrant farm workers are being harmed locally by this product. Vermont Gas has been partnering with the Goodrich Farm. And I took an excerpt from a migrant justice organizer who said, for Jose, the scene was a flashback. Earlier in the week, he had gone to Goodrich Farm, his former employer, to collect his paycheck. Accompanied by a migrant justice organizer, Jose found his former boss in the barn and asked for the $600 he was owed. In response, she forcefully shoved him out of the barn and slammed a door in his face. A supervisor also assaulted the migrant justice organizer. The farm owner screamed at the two to leave, threatening to call the police. Jose is not the first worker to face abuse at Goodrich Farm. Workers over the years have reported mistreatment and stolen wages. So all of this to say that there's this very thin veneer of we're doing something good and green around this whole renewable natural gas thing. And I will leave you with two major points. If you got nothing else out of my chaotic ramblings, a minuscule fraction of Vermont gas's total product, less than 2% the last time I checked, is coming from renewable sources. Those sources are largely a BP-owned landfill in Quebec. In essence, we're paying tariffs on Canadian trash and calling it clean. All of this can be found in Vermont Gas's manual on the subject. And two, there is no way to scale up renewable natural gas to fill an entire pipeline. And I think that's where I'll leave it. And basically, I'm here to say that renewable natural gas is not something that we should be even remotely considering clean. And I'm happy to defend that. Thanks.
Rachel,
Hi. Yeah, hi everybody. I'm Rachel Smolker. Some of you know me from years of opposition to the gas pipeline, but my main hat that I wear is as co-director of Biofuel Watch, which is an organization that works internationally, and I've been with them for something like 15 years now, doing campaign work on the negative impacts of large-scale bioenergy and biofuels. So my task here, I thought, would be to touch on the part of the clean fuel standard that is supposed to be met by biofuels and biomass as well. Next slide. A really fundamental question is whether biofuels actually reduce emissions. And there are many, many different flavors of biofuels, everything from, algae or gasification of wood, or some of these, advanced biofuels, which mostly haven't been available on commercial scale, to corn ethanol and so on. But the bottom line with basically all of the biofuels is that when you do a full life cycle analysis, including both the direct and indirect land use change, most biofuels emit more greenhouse gases than the fossil fuels that they are meant to replace. So I'm a bit of a data wonk, so I've provided sources, and I also am going to show you a few figures, which you don't really need to, explore in great detail. But if you can move on to the next slide. So the problem with most biofuels is that they require a large area of land. This is a figure from an article called Energy Sprawl or Energy Efficiency, and it shows the land use intensity for energy production from different kinds of biofuels. The top bar there, the very big, long, very high energy land intensity fuel is biodiesel from soy. And this is important because most of the heating fuels that we're going to be talking about are biodiesel or renewable diesel, which are vegetable oil-based fuels. Right below that, the second highest or longest bar that you see there is electricity from biomass, and below that, various other things. And you don't need to pay attention to them all, but we can just go to the next slide. The point here is just that there's very large land areas involved in producing, any kind of substantial amount of energy from biofuels. This is to remind me to specifically touch on these vegetable oil fuels and on a recent study that is very important. What's happening right now in the world of biofuels is that we're seeing just about every country, every state, every industry looking at how they can get off fossil fuels and instead use biofuels of one form or another, including the aviation industry, shipping industries, and little old Vermont with their clean heating standard by comparison. And so this recent study was put out in January of 2022, animal, vegetable, or mineral, by a consultancy that does a lot of good work on this. Serology, Chris Malins is the person. And what they are finding is that the new development of renewable diesel, which is different than biodiesel. Biodiesel is a mixture of fossil fuel with biodiesel. Renewable diesel is a term that refers to hydrotreated vegetable oil for the most part, which is a drop-in fuel. So you can use 100% renewable diesel as an alternative to diesel fuel. And that's the kind of fuel that mostly is being looked at for aviation. And we were seeing things like huge fossil fuel refineries out in California, for example, Marathon, Phillips 66, that are now converting to produce renewable diesel fuel. And the Energy Information Administration has said that if all of the announced plans come to fruition, renewable diesel production in the US would increase fivefold, requiring 17 million metric tons of additional demand for vegetable oils and fats. That is an astronomical amount of increased demand. And the paper goes on to say that that's very unlikely to be met, but this is what the industry is doing right now. Next slide, please. Vegetable oil-based fuels are really problematic because all of the vegetable oils, as commodities that are traded, are connected. And this figure, the one on the right, shows you over time the various different kinds of vegetable oils: soy oil, rapeseed oil, soybean, palm oil, and sunflower oil. And you can just see that the price mark for those, they very closely track one another. And because of this, when demand for one kind of vegetable oil is diverted into producing biofuels, it affects all of the other vegetable oil markets. And because of that, we see, essentially, we see indirect land use change associated with vegetable oil biofuels happening on a very large scale, where diversion of soybean oil into biofuel production in one place leads to palm oil expansion in another. When one use is displaced, the user will go and find a different vegetable oil, and they're largely interchangeable for different purposes is one of the reasons that this happens. So this indirect land use change and the connection between all of these vegetable oil markets is why land use change impacts are so important with these vegetable oil fuels. On the left is a figure that just shows oil production worldwide, and you can see how vegetable oil production has really skyrocketed. The blue and the green show you soybean oil and palm oil, which are the two of the main really problematic vegetable oil crops that are responsible for something like 60% of tropical deforestation and many other problems. Next slide, please.
Did I skip one? There we go.
Oh, you skipped a bunch. I think you can go back one more. No, okay, just go to that one then. Okay, so and then the clean heat standard also has a lot of space in it for advanced wood heating, which basically, my understanding, both means using wood pellets for home heating. Our organization has spent many years fighting back on, particularly on using large-scale wood pellet burning for coal conversion plants, and the import of wood pellets from the southeastern U.S. to Europe and especially to the UK. Home heating with wood is a little bit of a different beast, and it's something that I think requires a little bit more nuanced approach. But we need to be honest about the facts. Facts are that it is not carbon free to burn wood. It is true that maybe new trees will grow, but it could take decades for that to happen. And the carbon emissions from burning wood are actually higher than they are for burning coal. Air pollution concerns are serious health risk to public health, air pollution from burning wood, and especially from residential wood stoves, because they're very variable in terms of what the quality of the feedstock is, wood that's being burned, how efficient or inefficient the wood stove is, and so on. And then there's the impacts on the forest. So if everybody in the state of Vermont heated with wood, our forests would be really struggling to supply that much wood. So we have to be honest about what those impacts are. We also have to be honest about the fact that life cycle analyses done for wood heat with pellets needs to include the manufacturing and the transport of the wood that was used to make those pellets, and exactly what were those pellets made from. Because in fact, we've seen quite a bit of misinformation about that in some places where so-called waste and residues are being used, but it turns out not to be waste and residues, or the definition of waste and residue is changed in ways that we would not support. So I would say that for Vermont, heating with wood in some situations may be appropriate. It's certainly not going to be very appropriate in urban settings, but there are more efficient wood stoves that are available, and with proper operation, they can be cleaner. The problem is, of course, that we don't have any magic bullet for heating, and all of the options that we have, heating oil, propane, natural gas, wood, they all have their downsides. And we have to make choices about how we're going to do what heating, because we do need heat. So one thing that has crossed my mind in the process of thinking about this is that, we have two very inefficient, dirty electric power facilities in the state that burn wood, McNeil and Rygate. And in my opinion, the use of wood for that kind of inefficient power production is really egregious, and those facilities should be shut down. And we should be prioritizing any wood that we're going to use for residential heating rather than for inefficient power production. And I'm concerned about what's going to happen with the push for electrification that is going to just put sort of wind in the sails for keeping these facilities operating. Next slide, please. Or not. The next slide is just sort of my summary comment, which is, there are no free energy rides. And in my opinion, we need to just really dial down in ways that are maybe not yet even imagined on efficiency and conservation and reducing the demand for energy. There's no question in my mind that we cannot just heat with heat pumps. I think heat pumps are great, but they are not going to be fulfilling all of what we need in the heating sector. So really, when it comes down to it, we've got to really dial down on efficiency and conservation. And that's true with all energy use outside of heating. So that's all I'll say for now. I hope somebody will ask me a question about the waste and residues, the waste oil at some point, because I didn't touch on that, but I'd like to.
Ben, I think now I'm not sure what you covered before, but I think we are back to you now to talk about some of the other aspects of how this clean heat standard gets implemented.
Thanks, Steve. And I don't think I'm going to be rehashing any ground. I really try to stick to the pretty straight overview at the top. So I just wanted to speak briefly. Well, actually, let me just introduce myself because I didn't do that before. I was not planning on speaking at the beginning, as you probably gathered. My name is Ben Edgerly Walsh, he, him pronouns. I am the Climate and Energy Program Director with VPIRG. I've worked sort of across all the various sectors in energy in Vermont, heating, transportation, electricity. And I was going to, I just very briefly would say, you know, really sort of cut my teeth in the heating sector by pushing with many amazing allies, especially including some of the folks I know. Rachel was very deeply involved in this, and 350 Vermont was as well, against the Vermont gas pipeline. So I think, you know, really the top thing that I want to emphasize here is it feels like folks working on climate and thinking about the heating sector in Vermont share a pretty common set of concerns. And I think some of us are coming to different conclusions about the path forward. But I think we really are united in our understanding of the pitfalls of many of the available options. So I really wanted to focus just for a few minutes, because I know we're running a little bit long, and wanted to make sure we have plenty of time for questions on sort of the principles that VPIRG is trying to keep in mind as we are advocating about and on, and ultimately, I think, for this bill. That's not where we were going into this session, but I do think that is where we are. That is where we are headed. So I just didn't want to sort of bury the lead on that. Our top priority on this is that we actually get on track at long last to hit our climate requirements. They're not goals, they're legal requirements now under the Global Warming Solutions Act. There's never been a law in Vermont that takes an entire sector, an entire energy sector, and says, we actually have to hit these numbers, and here is the program that will do that, that will require companies to actually cut pollution by the amount legally required in Vermont. We've had other significant climate laws, Efficiency Vermont, Renewable Energy Standard. That's not what they did. This is a bigger deal than that. And that's exactly what this would do. It would legally require the fossil fuel companies selling heating fuels, thermal fuels into Vermont to get enough stuff done broadly that it would actually hit our climate numbers. Now, there are a lot of caveats, a lot of things that we need to get right along the way in order for that to actually play out in practice. But that is what the bill is drafted legally requires. And as I think what might have been mentioned in the chat, that's on both a life cycle basis and a burner tip basis. And that's actually really important. So that brings me to our second principle, is that this needs to actually, in a as transparent as possible way, recognizing we're dealing with very complex topics, aim at life cycle greenhouse gas emissions and base its requirements in terms of the sort of total requirement across the system, and the requirement on each individual fossil fuel company, and the math being done for each clean heat measure, each technology that can be a part of this transition, needs to be done on a life cycle basis. That is incredibly important, because if we didn't do that, all this policy would do, perhaps not all, but a lot of what this policy would do would be to simply shift greenhouse gases from Vermont to somewhere else. And that is that is not an outcome that anyone who genuinely cares about the climate crisis would find acceptable. So that transparent life cycle greenhouse gas emissions as the basis for this whole system is critically important. There are a lot of details about how that is going to be implemented. We have done everything we can, and will continue to work throughout the legislative process to really dial in and push for strong language in the bill, actually requiring that and requiring it to be done well. But the reality is, any significant regulatory solution like this is going to have a lot of work done in the implementation phase. And so we are going to have to, and we're committed to, really digging in at the Public Utilities Commission, which would be implementing a lot of this, to make sure that that is done well. Number three, this has to be an equitable policy. It has to be a policy that actually makes sure in a very clear, precise way that the PUC cannot mess up, that all Vermonters, low, moderate, upper income, are part of this transition and have clean heat measures available to them that can provide them with cleaner, more affordable heating options. That is actually baked into the bill at this point. It was not going into the legislative session. It is now. I do think it needs to be dialed in a little bit more, but the reality is there are very specific numbers in the bill that would require the Public Utilities Commission to get a really significant percentage of the total clean heat measures being deployed under this policy to low income Vermonters and moderate income Vermonters. Number 3, there can't be any double counting across sectors. When we first started digging into this policy, one of the very first things that jumped out at me was, if you're allowing RNG, renewable natural gas, to play into this, and that RNG is being generated, from a landfill in Vermont, for instance, methane that would have been flared otherwise, but instead would be captured and burned in the thermal sector, or at a farm, methane that would otherwise be going up into the atmosphere, causing all sorts of climate havoc, but instead is captured from a manure pit and then burned in the thermal sector. If that is allowed to count as a reduction in both the ag or waste sector and the thermal sector, that is an incredibly significant problem, and the bill now has language in it to prevent that. The last couple of things that I will mention, one, sort of I think it's important to understand that this, and I have my concerns about this, but it is attempting to be a technology neutral policy. It will, I think, an objective view of this would say that it is going to result in a lot of electrification, a fair bit of weatherization, and also biofuels and renewable natural gas. And what we have been striving for is a policy that actually makes sure that electrification and weatherization play a really significant role in this transition. And I believe the bill has gotten significantly better in that regard. And I'd also encourage folks, if you're advocating on this and you're not totally sure about the policy, or you don't really know what to think because it's a complicated policy and you haven't had enough time in your busy lives in the middle of this damn pandemic to figure it out, there is absolutely no reason not to talk to your representatives and say, look, I don't know about this thing, but if you think you're going to do it, you got to make sure it has a heck of a lot of electrification and weatherization in it. And that's, some of the efficiency, I think, that Rachel was talking about. We need to go really, really big on that. There's no question about it. Last note, and then I'll stop. I think it's also really important to understand this policy is not happening in a vacuum. It is happening in the context of multiple other things happening this legislative session, and a lot of organizations that are hell-bent on seeing a lot of other changes in the climate policy realm. Just a few examples of that. There is also a really significant investment being made. It's not across the finish line yet. It's not May. This is not on the governor's desk, but it looks very likely that there will be north of $100 million for weatherization, for low income and moderate income weatherization, for electrification, for change outs for low and moderate income Vermonters for their water heaters. So that is all happening at the same time. It's not in this bill, but as long as it happens, I don't care what bill it ends up in. There's also the first environmental justice bill in Vermont being moved in the Senate that just passed out just a day after this moved out of House Energy, that passed out of Senate Natural. And our organizations, and I'll speak for VPIRG here, are absolutely committed to cleaning up our electric sector. That's not what this call is about, this webinar is about, but we really need to do better there. We need to dramatically scale up especially the new in-state renewables being built. And we're absolutely committed to that. So that's the sort of context that this is happening within. It's not happening in the same bill, but it's all happening. Thanks so much, Steve. And thanks for pulling this together. And thanks for everyone for putting questions. I know I saw some popping up while I was talking. I was trying not to pay attention to them so I could focus on what I was saying, but looking forward to digging into some of this.
We do. Thanks a lot, Ben. Yeah, we do have some great questions here. I see some have been answered. I have to say that if there were any that came up before I managed to get back on to the call here, I won't see them. So maybe somebody else already answered them. Let's see. Let's see. There are a couple of land use questions. Richard asks, how does the amount of land needed per heat per energy unit compare between biofuels and solar and wind? I wonder if that's, Rachel, if that was something that was on your slide. You were comparing land use and a variety of fuels and energy sources. I don't know if those were on there or not.
It went by too fast to see.
Yeah, I actually don't remember whether it's on there or not, to tell you the truth, but there have been a lot of studies that have looked at that comparison, and there's a lot more energy to be achieved from solar panels than there is from per unit of land, which is not to say that we should just put solar panels everywhere. And on top of that, the issue is liquid biofuels versus electric power. And those are different kinds of energy that are both land.
So I see solar photovoltaic 36.9 compared to the biofuels, maybe 10 or plus times as much, and wind double solar there. So does that answer your question? Looks like it's got it there.
Yes, thank you. It went by too fast before.
Yes, well, there we go. Okay, let's see, next question. Boy, there are a lot of questions here. Okay. Trying to find some that have not been answered yet. I will say that one of the things that, as the Sierra Club, one of the things we're eager to see happen is to have a more clear assessment of all that, to really ask the PUC as they study this stuff to get in there and figure out what the impacts are, not just on a per unit, but really as Vermont scales up on these things, as we scale up on whether it's biodiesel or renewable natural gas, what are the impacts as that source grows? And we aren't the only ones doing this. It's happening everywhere. The movement towards renewable natural gas is happening across the country, and I think there are real questions about absolute scale, absolute availability, as well as growing impacts. And when do you run into that conflict between energy crops and food crops that has real impacts on human beings? And it happens. It's happened before, and it'll happen again. They're real impacts. And how do you relate that to our Vermont situation? I think it would be really important. Plus, local impacts of those various types of farm situations. Let's see.
Steve,
I could speak
jump
to that
in
if you'd like.
Ben, yeah, I couldn't tell.
I had a quick answer to one of the questions in here, just as a clarification point. And then maybe, I couldn't see you, but I think that was Julie speaking up.
Yes.
So I think this is quick. So let me just knock it off and then we can shift back to Julie. Ned asked, why is the benefit to low income so low? 16%. The environmental justice bill is 55% for EJ focused populations. Is the clean heat standard percent an additional factor? So basically what's going on there is the thermal sector is in the bill defined as the residential, commercial, and industrial fuel sector. They're sort of all considered thermal end uses. But it's not just space heating in the residential sector. That is a portion of it. That is about 55% of that sector. But the rest is sort of in the commercial and industrial. So when you actually do the math to say, okay, so it's 55% residential, and then you look at low income and moderate income, what this is saying, if you add up those two, 16 and 16, you're talking about more than half of the residential sector would need to be served into that sort of low and moderate income, those two bands, and they're defined as two different bands in the bill. And that's actually really important because you don't want to underserve either at the expense of the other, if that makes sense. And so basically it's aiming to be essentially proportional to low income and moderate income Vermonters' share of the population. But it looks low because it's also talking about commercial and industrial fuels. I hope that made sense.
I was just going to touch on what Steve was asking, and I'm sure Rachel has things about this too, but in terms of scaling up something like renewable natural gas and putting that into a pipeline, it doesn't scale up. And there have been a number of studies on this, that if you were to take all of the methane that you could capture from all of the waste in the United States, or even all of the waste just in California, that would never meet more than like 2 to 5% of the state's or the country's need for that energy. It's not a replacement for fracked gas. It is really just an implement to keep the fracked gas industry alive.
I think that's consistent with what I've seen. I might have seen slightly, I haven't seen any numbers over 10%. I've seen a bunch of different numbers for how much they're, at full scale, how much of that is there. And I can't tell you if that's strictly from farms or if it includes landfills, but I think it was still not something that I think that it's actually one of the pluses that I would add to this bill is that it provides a kind of a ramp for people in the fossil fuel industry who are real people too, and they are going to be around. And it's not only them, but it's the fact that it's going to take a while to get us all fully winterized and down to zero energy homes or zero carbon emission homes. So that's an important aspect of this, but I think it's a mistake for whether it's biodiesel or RNG for those providers to expect that those fuels are going to be there forever. I think that they're going to have to deal with big changes, and this is not. It would be unfair to them for this law to give them the impression that way of doing business is going to be around forever. Let's see. There are a few questions. Rachel, you may have this about used oils, waste oil, cooking oil.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you. Yeah, this is a trend again in the biofuel world right now to really push on the used cooking oil because it doesn't involve the land use change that's so problematic with all these other vegetable oil fuels, and then it gets higher rates of subsidies, for example, in Europe. I really wanted to touch on this because what is coming up now is that there's a tremendous amount of fraud going on with what is being claimed as used cooking oil. And the more people are looking into this, the more they're finding that other kinds of oils are being used and they're being marketed, and the certification bodies that are responsible for this are basically not doing their job. This is especially rampant in Europe right now. There was a fraud case in the Netherlands that sort of sparked it, and the European Commission is now pretty much demanding that the certification industry provide data that shows that these claims about used cooking oil. And, it's common sense because, we don't make that much used cooking oil. The quantity of used cooking oil, genuine used cooking oil that's available and that's been collected from all the dispersed sources where it's produced and used is very limited. So I want to just, sort of put that as a like red flag. The thing of like used cooking oil is going to save us all is very unlikely. There's so many demands. Like I said before, this new study on hydrotreated vegetable oil. I mean, we are seeing from every, huge refineries are opening up. They're all wanting vegetable oil in vast quantities. Vermont's demand is going to be in competition with even just the neighboring states that have their own clean heat standards with biodiesel demand. And we don't make a lot of vegetable oil, for biofuels here in New England. So we're all going to be competing.
Well, we have a couple of similar questions about, there's a question that Brian raises, the bill is too narrow in its definition of heating fuels, only counting fossil fuels, not the broad definition that includes all the plant-based polluters like biofuels and biomass and wood in all forms. I actually not sure that that's accurate. I think that the bill looks at the greenhouse gas emissions from fuels, no matter what they are, on both sides, on both on the whatever is used currently and on what gets used in the future. It looks at it's supposed to look at their true life cycle cost, and it's really the differential that we're shooting for, going from a higher to a lower value. So Brian, I think that it does cover all those things. Ben, I see you got your hand up there.
Oh, I can speak to that briefly. There are a bunch of things. I mean, obviously there's a lot going on in the chat. And there were a couple of themes popping out at me. I think at least one of them sort of triggered by something that I said. So I wanted to speak to a couple of those as well. But yeah, I mean, Steve, you're absolutely right that the bill requires a life cycle assessment of all fossil fuels and clean heat measures. So essentially anything that, so all the biofuels, RNG, all the rest, and then clean heat measures like electrification, heat pumps, weatherization, and then all the fossil fuels. So nobody's sort of getting out of that life cycle assessment. There's one definition in the bill that is, heating fuel equating to fossil fuels, but is not going to sort of put biofuels like out of some of the assessments in any way. So I did want to briefly touch on a couple of other things. Hold on, let me just put my hand down. One, there was a question again, just in terms of clarification in the chat. No, it is very clear in the bill, switching from one fossil fuel to another fossil fuel, it cannot be counted as a clean heat measure, even if the other fossil fuel is marginally better from a greenhouse gas standpoint. That's not a thing that's allowed in the bill, period. And then the other sort of question along those lines around, is it actually requiring a reduction in fossil fuel use? The straight answer is yes, absolutely. It doesn't literally use like that sentence in the bill, but because of the way the bill lays out the requirements and the fact that fossil fuels are not eligible clean heat measures that I just covered, there's no way for anything other than a reduction in fossil fuels with the requirements we have under the Solutions Act, which are again baked into this bill, to happen. Exactly how it happens is an open question. Obviously, there's a spirited debate in the chat about how it should happen, what should be and when it should be out, what the right math on that is. But certainly it would be a move away from fossil fuels. There's no question about that. I also wanted to, sticking on the clean heat standard for a second, and I want to just touch on wind, which is coming up a fair bit in the chat. One thing that's been sort of thrown out there a few times is there's a real problem with scaling some of these things like RNG. I think that's right. And I think that actually combined with the fact that if you look at even life cycle assessments of these fuels that I think many of us would disagree with, feel like they were incomplete or overly generous to some of these biofuels. And the fact that for most biofuels currently being produced and most equipment currently in use, you can't actually use B100 like off the bat here, right? Like in most heating equipment in Vermont. So there really is no way for the math to work where this is just going to be a bunch of biofuels and RNG, right? And so again, I'll return to electrification and weatherization. And Rachel, you are absolutely right. We need to do an immense amount of efficiency and conservation across all sectors, but certainly in the thermal sector. There's no question about that. You put it very well. There's no silver bullet. I am a huge fan of heat pumps. For many years, I lived in a home that had no fossil fuels, only a heat pump as the primary source and a wood stove that we used to some degree. That is totally doable in Vermont, but it's not going to be an option for everyone. And as our other speakers have laid out, there are very good reasons not to rely heavily on any combustion either. And that's basically all of the ways you heat your home, right? You weatherize to try to get closer to passive. You can use electrification technologies, or you can use some sort of combustion, burning something. None of those are perfect. And so we need to figure out the best possible mix to allow people to keep on living in a cold state like Vermont. And that's where we're trying to push this bill. Last point, and I know we're getting close, so maybe we have time for one more question and someone else can answer it, so I don't take up too much time. But there's been some debate in the chat about wind. I will just say very clearly that I do not think we can approach the climate crisis in a moral way and not build as much wind and solar in Vermont as we can manage. That is absolutely essential. We have for far too long relied on other places, mostly very far away, to supply our energy. 70% of our energy, more or less, comes from fossil fuels, and we do not largely bear the burden of the production of those fuels in this state. We need to actually start producing more of our own energy. That is critical, and we are not doing nearly enough of it. If we're serious about heating our homes in a clean way, especially if we have concerns about biofuels and RNG, and we want to shift to heat pumps in a significant way, we need to power those cleanly. And that means we can't just say, hey, who else can produce this renewable electricity for us? We need to move on from that mentality. So that is something that we are definitely working towards and want to see a much bigger move in Vermont towards, in addition to, not instead of, because it has to be both and the clean heat standard.
Yeah, and I think that's a good point. And it's within the clean heat standard, there's the tech side of doing weatherization and heat pumps and all that. And then there's the sort of the biofuel side. I don't think we know which of those is going to be favored. I think that it, to some degree, will come down to what's cheapest. A lot of providers that have to do this stuff will only have one option because that's all they do. But I haven't seen. I don't know if the economic analysis has really been done to see what are the most likely solutions that will be applied. Will it be, how far would we go with biomass energy or biofuels? How far would we go with weatherization or heat pumps? And which are going to be the cheapest options? But it will. There's really quite a lot to be seen here. We are at the end of our hour, and I just want to go to Rachel and Julie for a second to see if you have any closing comments here. Rachel, anything to say at the end here?
Sure. It's very, I guess, frustrating to me. I think, not just in terms of the heating sector, residential heating, or, heating in general, but in energy discussions overall, something to keep in mind is that I think somewhere around 10 or 12% of our overall energy is from anything that could remotely be considered renewable, and by definitions that we might not even agree with. And so it's an extremely steep uphill climb to try to imagine, Vermont being able to heat the way that we're accustomed to with renewables. And that's the hard facts of the matter, in my view. That's why I keep just wanting this conversation to really focus much more seriously on how to live with a whole lot less, because I see that as the only really viable pathway forward.
I would agree. It doesn't get talked about enough. Thank you, Rachel. Julie?
Sure. Thank you so much for having me on this panel. Yeah, if you've gotten nothing else from me, then just know that renewable natural gas is not this cure-all that it's being made out to be. I will leave I'm happy to answer any questions from anyone or get in contact with anyone or speak to especially legislators or anybody. I'll drop my email in the chat, and thanks again for listening to me talk about this.
Great. Well, thank you. There have been so many great points and questions made in the chat. I'm sorry we didn't get to everybody's questions. There were some great ones there. If you want to save the chat, I don't know if everybody knows how, but down there at the bottom of the chat column, on the right-hand side of that bottom box, there's those three little dots there. And if you click on those, you'll be able to save the chat. And that'll probably show up in a brand new Zoom folder on your somewhere on your computer. And then you'll have all of these questions. There's some great, really useful links that people have posted. And so again, great. Thanks everybody for showing up. A great discussion. As Rob mentioned, actually, before most of you got on, he may have this up on Friday, probably Monday, to take a look or to share, and we'll be sure to get the link to the recording out to everybody. Rob, did you have any closing comment?
Yeah, just as like I said, Steve just said, it will be posted up on our website in the next couple of days. I'm just returning from vacation actually today, so I'll be doing it in the next couple of days. But I'll email it to everybody who registered as well, so you don't have to go searching for it. So just be patient on that, and I'll try to, since there were so many questions, I will try to copy of them and then forward it to the three panelists if they want to answer. But I'll do that. So thank you for your time, but you can go to our website and see all the other conversations posted and upcoming events. So thank you all, and thank you for the presentation that I learned a lot from. So thanks.
Thanks, everybody.